It is very good to see other veterans of those old campaigns in the audience today, men of great substance, such as Sam Swirling, who in my view is one of the very best speakers ever produced by the British right wing. Sam was a mentor to me in my early days. I remember going to a Monday Club meeting in 1984 or 85, and Sam was there, and we've been friends ever since, so it's wonderful to see him in the audience today. Also, Adrian Davis, a long-standing friend and a very accomplished lawyer, who struck out some years ago with the Freedom Party, a party which achieved some measure of success in the West Midlands. And I'm also delighted to be in the presence of the Right Honourable Lord Sudeley, whom I remember in many of the Monday Club battles and coverages in the newspaper. He was always referred to as the Member of Parliament for the 18th century, and wonderful things such as that. Lord Sudeley produced a marvellous booklet some years ago for the Monday Club on the meaning of the hereditary peerage, the House of Lords, and so on. And that was, as I remember, a booklet that achieved a great deal of coverage for the old Monday Club. I was also the founder of the University of Essex Monday Club. And in 1985, I travelled as a young student to Belfast to join with tens of thousands of my fellow countrymen in Ulster in the huge rally against the then Anglo-Irish Agreement. Yet another example, along with the Common Market, the sellout of Rhodesia and the Maastricht Treaty, of the Conservative Party's commitment to our country and way of life. I'll never forget, as an Englishman, the welcome I received from the people of Northern Ireland in the city's main square that morning. Folk patting me on the back, enthusiastically taking the University of Essex Monday Club leaflets that I printed on an old photocopier when no one from the Student Union Commissariat was watching. And then I carried over to Ulster with me in a battered hold all of the leaflets. And I remember, it's one of the defining moments of my political life. I remember the scene in the centre of Belfast that morning. From the flagpoles of the city's hall flew the Union Jack and all the flags of the British home nations. And I felt very pleased that the loyal people of that embattled province could see that at least somebody from England cared enough about them to stand with them in their hour of need. And that's another piece of the Monday Club's heritage, that we were always very much behind the Northern Ireland Unionists and the whole idea of the Union. Now, as you can imagine, it was somewhat difficult being a right-winger and a radical traditionalist at the overwhelmingly left-wing University of Essex. And I can recall, ladies and gentlemen, how I eventually left my communism classes due to lousy marks. But lame jokes aside, the university, despite its prevailing ideology, had and has a very good politics course, albeit if it is skewed in one direction. So I hope they'll forgive me for exercising my right to free speech. In the Monday Club of 1985 to 1992, I believe that we achieved a high watermark in political campaigning. And may I say that our greatest triumph of that period was down to Gregory Lord of Frost. Now, in 1991, the debate over the Maastricht Treaty, as I'm sure Sam will remember, was reaching a fever pitch. The great journalist and writer, Paul Johnson, one of British sovereignty's most robust defenders, had demolished the treaty in his many articles for the Sunday Telegraph, describing this treaty, of which the Conservative Prime Minister John Major was all in favour, as death by 1,000 Brussels cuts and a farewell to the England he, Paul Johnson, loved. More interestingly, in that article, he noted how, thanks to the grey, grim, politically correct bureaucrats of this new continental system, the culture of Europe itself was fading just as surely as that of our own country. And I think that that comment of Paul Johnson's ties a great deal into what we heard from our previous speaker, that the liberal bureaucratic elites who are working within Europe are diminishing Europe's own culture and identity. Now, going back to Gregory's role, at the Tory conference of October 1991, he organised a fringe meeting which, in characteristic Gregory style, would dwarf not just the proceedings on the fringe, but the whole conference. And booked at the Monday Club Fringe meeting at the very aptly named Empire Hotel Blackpool was Enoch Powell, who was the greatest Tory Prime Minister that Britain ever had. Mr. Powell had in the 1980s spoken to the Monday Club many times, and I remember him speaking at one dinner on the fact that we are now, in relation to our conflict with what is now the European Union, we are in a struggle for national survival that's probably as acute as the threat which faced Britain in the summer of 1940 during the Battle of Britain. And that was Powell's view at one of the great Monday Club dinners that we held. But thanks to Gregory, Powell's voice was heard loud and clear at that conference, warning the delegates and the ministers of John Major's government and the whole of the British people of what they stood to lose if the government signed us into an irrevocable European Union, which is what the Maastricht Treaty set out to do. And I would like to pay tribute at this conference this morning to the late Enoch Powell and all that he meant to me and to many of us, and also to Gregory Lord Frost for his outstanding leadership at the time, ensuring that the old Monday Club stood at the very centre of that storm. However, I've actually been asked, if you'll forgive that digression into the battles of the past, I've actually been asked to speak to you on the theme of Englishness and the meaning of English nationhood. So I don't think my speech is going to be quite as long as our previous speakers, so we can have a discussion afterwards. I'm willing to take questions. But the idea of talking about Englishness and nationhood and so on is so difficult because I don't really know where to start. It's a vast subject. But I'd like to begin perhaps by going back to another facet of Enoch Powell. Englishness was a defining characteristic of his life. And many of you may have seen the fascinating television biographies of Enoch Powell, with those wonderful black and white films of Enoch with cap and tweed jacket, his family dutifully following him as he explored English country churches, trying to enthuse his children by pointing out Norman or perpendicular arches and the many curiosities of our ancient parish churches. I believe they were known as the Powell picnics, as I recall. But Enoch also said at a meeting of the Royal Society of St. George in 1964, "Guard well the parent stem of England and its royal talisman, for we know not what branches yet that wonderful tree will have the power to put forth." His was a vision of England, past, present and future. And isn't it interesting to contrast his moving use of the English language with the slang-like management speak of our present Prime Minister, a man who seems more interested in assisting the Chinese in their asset stripping of Britain than in reflecting and honouring our national history and preserving something recognisable for future generations. Now, Enoch Powell was a man of the West Midlands. He represented Wolverhampton, as many of you will remember. The West Midlands, the urban face of this part of Britain, has changed out of all recognition. And I wonder how that most patient, pipe-smoking Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, a man of the county of Worcestershire, would react to the face of England today. And it seems that when not addressing Empire Day rallies in Hyde Park or the Empire Parliamentary Association, Stanley Baldwin seemed to be forever receiving the freedom of this or that city, or thanking one or other august body for making him an honorary Highlander or an honorary Welshman. So he was in great demand on the speaking circuit. On the 6th of July 1928, he was given the freedom of the city of Winchester, and he responded with this remarkable speech dedicated to the wealth and glory of England, and I'd like to quote something from it. And Baldwin said, "I want to say a word or two to you this afternoon, and there could be no more suitable place than Winchester to say it, of my desire to preserve the beauty of our country." Can you imagine the Prime Minister saying this to her? Baldwin continued, "There is nothing meritorious in such a desire. It is the wealth and the glory of England, this beauty which has been saved through the centuries. There can be nothing more disastrous, nothing more wicked on our part than to waste it, to dissipate it and destroy it in our profligacy as a priceless and irreplaceable heritage. I have been asked, as all people in my position must be, to undertake many salutary reforms, to reform the calendar, to make the Channel tunnel, to repay the national debt. But you may reform the calendar without changing our climate. You may make a Channel tunnel to enable people to go and buy dresses in Paris. You may pay off the national debt. And as many economists tell you, you will be no better off when you have done it. But to preserve the beauties of our country, that is something worth living for. I read the other day the words of a well-known architect who said, it is no exaggeration to say that in 50 years, at the rate so-called improvements are being made, the destruction of all the beauty and charm with which our ancestors enhanced their towns and villages will be complete. So I think Baldwin is a very overlooked figure, and we often respond and know about the great speeches that Churchill made on Englishness, but we ought to look at Baldwin's contribution to this political discourse, and I think he's a very overlooked figure. Now, the Western and Midland counties from which Enoch Powell and Stanley Baldwin came, the old kingdom of Mercia, seem to have given birth to many other English visionaries. The vision of Piers Plowman by William Langland in the 14th century, the music of Edward Elgar, who roamed the Malvern Hills in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, believing that music was all around him in the landscape and in the air. And also the yearning and loss and ghosts of the past in A.E. Houseman's A Shropshire Lad. And I'd also like to quote the contemporary English poet Geoffrey Hill, who was born at Bromsgrove in 1932. And in this short poem I'm about to read to you, which is taken from his Mercian hymns, we are with the poet, it seems, having discovered a relic from the past, a faded, long-buried coin found under the soil. And this short poem reminds me very much of the church shadows and the Houseman settings as evoked by Enoch Powell. And I hope you will agree that it's a powerful and profound image of Englishness, and in a sense of a lost realm. And this is Geoffrey Hill's poem. Trim the lamp, polish the lens, draw one by one rare coins to the light. Ringed by its own lustre, the masterful head emerges, kempt and jutting out of England's well. Far from the under-kingdom of crinoid and crayfish, the runestone's province, Rex totius anglorum patriae, coiffed and ageless, portrays the self-possession of his possession, cushioned on a legend. So it's obvious the poet's discovered a coin of an ancient British king. Now, a feeling for an ancient past, for time out of mind, emerges in the writings of the modern critic and author Peter Ackroyd, who has traced the origins of the English imagination in his magnificent work, Albion. And in another of his books, called Thames, Sacred River, he finds in the waters of the river and the surrounding landscape a sense of folklore and mythology, the threads from which England came. And at Abingdon in Oxfordshire, Peter Ackroyd discovers a site of great antiquity, the remains of a circle, signs of human activity, he says, while the inner area seems to have been used for specific rites and ceremonies. At the core was worship. The defined space might also offer a special form of protection, blessed by the river. And Ackroyd continues, the connection between their ancestors and the Thames must have been well known through folk myth and oral memory. By the causewayed enclosure at Abingdon can be found a number of long oval barrels. These burial mounds were covered in soil and chalk. They would have gleamed white in the landscape. Now, Peter Ackroyd also travels to Dorchester, which is just south of Oxford, whose Saxon and medieval abbey plays host to today's English Music Festival. And just beyond Dorchester are the Whitterman Clumps, a wooded ridge which inspired the 20th century English artist Paul Nash, who died in 1946. And the chalk downland and hill forts gave the artist a spiritual or even pagan inspiration. And Paul Nash said that the view here was of a beautiful legendary country haunted by old gods long forgotten. Now, the archaeologist Charles Green, in tracing the people who worshipped those gods, noted, it is a commonplace that in the veins of most modern Englishmen there runs the blood of many ancestral peoples. We may turn, for example, to Daniel Defoe, who in 1703 gave us The True-Born Englishman. I hope you don't mind if I read another poem to you. And Defoe said, the Western Angles, all the rest subdued, a bloody nation, barbarous and rude, who by tenure of the sword possessed one part of Britain and subdued the rest. And as great things denominate the small, the conquering part gave title to the whole. The Scot, Pict, Briton, Roman, Dane submit, and with the English Saxon all unite. Defoe then went on to satirise at greater length the Norman strain of this hodgepodge. But this mongrellism, as Green goes on to explain, can be and is often somewhat exaggerated. And he says this, for Angles, Saxons, Frisians, Jutes, Danes and Norsemen were little more than tribal names of folk of closely related stock, of cognate speech and culture. Normans too were transplanted Norsemen, somewhat modified by admixture with Saxons and Franks, another northern tribal group. And though the ancient British element, itself compounded of many strains, has modified the Nordic mixture, it is still to be shown that its proportion is considerable in the English amalgam. And this statement by the archaeologist Charles Green, ladies and gentlemen, is, I believe, what comes very close to explaining the true essence of England. And when I say the name England, I'm not simply referring to a country on its own, but England as part of a united Britain, part of the unique culture of the British Isles and the United Kingdom, which our politicians have done so little to defend, nurture and celebrate. Writing in 1985, the historian David Cannadine, who was commenting on the idea of nostalgia and of a particularly fine and well-presented exhibition held in Washington, D.C. that year, devoted to the art of the country house, David Cannadine said the following, for the argument in favour of museums rather than country houses as the best medium of display presupposes that English art galleries are in a position to acquire, to show such beautiful things in surroundings and conditions comparable to those available in Washington. Many British museums are almost as shambolic and uninviting as the most run-down country house. The Thatcher government is not much concerned about this. The idea that works of art may elevate the mind and lift the spirit and that they should be freely and easily available for all, is not something which seems to concern her administration very much. But of course, Mrs. Thatcher herself is no better disposed to the country house world, which is so valued and vaunted in this Washington exhibition. She may approve of the tourist trade as a dollar earner, but her personal brand of radical and petty bourgeois conservatism has no time for the escapist syndrome, which she sees as anachronistically irrelevant to the Britain of 1985. Her heroes, David Cunningham goes on, her heroes are self-made men and self-made failures, like Clive Sinclair, Freddie Baker and Cecil Parkinson. She hates the idea of Britain as a museum society, intent on embalming itself, whether the impulse comes from the left, in the shape of Scargill and the miners, or from the right, in the form of country house owners and their propagandists. So it seems very little has changed from the world of 1985 to the world of 2015. Led today by a man who didn't even know what the name Magna Carta signified, the Philistine Conservative Party of 2015 parrots the language of diversity and political correctness, the language of the left. Meanwhile, the Labour Party of Jeremy Corbyn has abandoned the last strongholds of what was the industrial working class of Britain, upholding instead the slogans and demands of Marxist public sector unions. In Scotland and Wales, separatist parties are seeking to make the people of these islands strangers to one another, turning their backs on their natural neighbours in England, and yet reaching out to the EU and telling people in Glasgow and Cardiff that they should welcome mass immigration. I believe, ladies and gentlemen, that we need to turn to such figures as John Betjeman, who looked to the peaceful inner life of England, the peaceful suburbs of Metroland, to the country that existed before intrinsically English buildings were knocked down to make way for what Betjeman described as concrete rent collectors' slabs. And we also, if we feel that the country has been lost, I believe that we can gain some kind of inspiration from such happenings as the Queen's Diamond Jubilee celebrations 3 years ago, in which a widespread celebration among the British people gave us a sense that the monarchy is one of the last remaining embodiments of British heritage and identity, has some life left in it, and there is still some following and some animation of the national spirit. I'd like to finish with just a few words again from Stanley Baldwin, and this time Stanley Baldwin is speaking to the Junior Imperial League in London on March the 10th, 1928. And he's full of hope for the future. And he says, "So every one of you, be ready in time to take up the torch from the hand of the generation that drops it. Make it give a brighter light, carry it farther with stronger steps. Let us feel when our time comes to hand it on, that you will do your duty and in your turn pass it on to a generation instructed by you, which will be yet better, so that in long time distant, and after our puny lights have been extinguished, the kingdoms of the world may be flooded with the light which we only see today in our dreams." We can only hope that by celebrating the culture of England and fighting for our wider British identity, independence and traditions, the TBG may help to turn the tide against the current miasmic atmosphere of indifference, decay and loss. Thank you.